Welcome back to the Mobile Hunter Podcast, and this is the Whitetail Apprentice Series. I'm your host, Josh Luck, and today I am flying solo. On today's episode, we're going to get into a topic that we've gotten into before. We talked a little about it on the Whitetail Apprentice Series last season with some friends of ours, some hunters that are very successful and actually they do use the moon as part of their hunting strategy. But since then, there has been some newer research that has been done and come out that I just wanted to make sure our listeners were also aware of, just to kind of get a full picture of how it might apply to their situation or how it might not apply to their situation. So to help with this conversation, I have back on the podcast, Mr. Luke Resop. Luke, how you doing?
I'm doing very well, and I'm glad to be here.
Yes, thank you very much for hopping back on. It's always a pleasure talking with you. So today we're going to talk about the publication. It is titled, Lunar Legends, Does the Moon Influence Buck Activity? Who came up with that title, by the way?
I don't know. That's pretty witty, so it was probably Bronson.
When that publication came out, and did it come out this year?
I think it came out early this year. Let's see.
It came out early this year, but you guys had discussed it on the MSU Deer Lab podcast. I can't remember if it was earlier this year or towards the end of last year.
Yeah, the podcast came out in May, or the publication came out in May of 25.
Okay.
So the podcast was sometime around then.
Yeah, I was trying to go back, and I'll try and link it in here. It might be... Let's see, the Deer University podcast here. Lunar Table Fables. Does the moon affect buck activity?
That actually came out November 15th, 2024.
Yeah.
Before.
So that buck movement study that you guys had done a few years ago, you utilized some of that same data, correct, to actually take a look at different aspects of the moon. That podcast that you guys did on November 15th, again, I'll try and link it in the show notes here, but I thought you guys did a very good job of breaking everything down. And then the publication came out in May of this year. So I wanted to just chat with you about it because I think you guys, in my opinion, is one of the most comprehensive moon studies to date, right? There's nothing else I think that touches it.
Yeah, when we started to dive into the moon stuff, the goal for the moon analysis that we did, and I use we very loosely. I want to start by saying that I'm simply a representative and the spokesperson here for Dr. Natasha Neary and Dr. Bronson Strickland, who did the lion's share of the work for this. So the vast majority of what I'm going to discuss is, their work. I'm just here to kind of disseminate it to the audience. But when we sat down and kind of formulated the idea and decided to really jump into this moon analysis, we wanted it to be conclusive. Not necessarily completely exhaustive, because there's always more rabbit holes you can go down. Yep. But we did not want to, conduct an analysis and then as soon as we post the results either on our social media or talk about them on a podcast, we did not want 50% of our listeners to be like, well, you didn't account for, or you forgot to look at, or, but this is what I see and y'all didn't even look at this. And so we'll probably get into this in a minute, but we started the process not just diving headfirst into the analysis, but we conducted a fairly comprehensive survey of our followers and of our listeners to ask how they kind of wanted us to approach the topic.
Yeah, which was one of the things I liked the most about how you guys presented the data, right? Because it wasn't questions that you had. I said it was the questions your viewers and listeners had, right? So what the public wanted to know, and then you looked at the data based on what they wanted to know, which I think is a very important component of this.
Yep.
So I'm actually going to try and share my screen here and pull up this publication, so that way people watching the video can kind of follow along here. All right, does this popping up on you?
Yep, I've got it.
Okay. So based on what we just said, I'll kind of scroll down here. So this is kind of an abstract, gives you an idea of the study. But then right here, what do hunters think about the moon's influence of deer activity? So can Luke, Can you kind of go through how you guys did your survey and what hunters were most interested in?
Sure. So, like I said, before we really dove headfirst into this topic, we wanted to make sure that the questions we were asking from a research perspective were very representative of what the hunting community in general believed about the moon. So we essentially put out a survey on Facebook and Instagram, and hunters, our followers would click on it. It would take them to a Qualtrics survey external to Facebook. And the way we had this survey designed was it was essentially nested. Questions were nested within one another. So, for example, the first question in the survey was, do you think that the moon influences buck movement? And if the answer to that question was no, that was the end of the survey.
Mm-hmm.
But if the answer to that question was yes, then the survey spit out another question, and it was, okay, how do you think the moon influences buck movement? Do you think it's the position of the moon? Do you think it's the phase of the moon? Do you think it's a combination of? Do you think it's the closeness or the distance of the moon to Earth? And every time one of those questions was answered, it would branch off into a subset of questions that got deeper and deeper and more specific into the nitty gritty, which really allowed us to quantify what hunters believed to be true about the moon and its influence on buck movement. So I guess jumping into the results that you've got pulled up here, 83% of our respondents, and we had 1,439 hunters respond to this survey. Now, there's obviously way more than 1,400 people out there that are hunting and have heard theories on the moon, but we are quite confident that that number is our results are very representative of the hunting public at large. So about 1,500 people took the survey, and of those, 83% of hunters believe that the moon has some effect on deer activity. So when we break that 83% down of the hunters that believe there is an influence of the moon on buck activity, the majority of them believe that the influence of the moon is some combination between moon phase and moon position. So you need to consider both moon phase, so new moon, full moon, waxing, waning, etc., and the position of the moon. Is the moon overhead? Is the moon underfoot? Is the moon rising? Is the moon setting? So you need to combine phase and position to accurately predict how the moon is going to influence deer movement. A lesser percentage, 25% of people thought it was just moon phase, so new moon, full moon, and 13% thought it was just moon position. So I guess I don't know if you mentioned this earlier, but this podcast is going to be full of percentages and numbers and all sorts of data that is going to be kind of hard. It's hard for me to interpret anyway if I'm just hearing it. It is much easier to track if you're watching this on YouTube or wherever it's going to be posted. So I'd highly recommend that you pull this up and watch it on a screen. It'll make it easier to digest all this information.
Yeah. What I said earlier, as far as it being the most comprehensive, I don't know if I've seen another study that took all of the things that you just mentioned into consideration, as far as the phase, as far as the position, overhead, underfoot. You guys look at red moon in this. I can't think of the name of it. It's eluding me, but I know you guys hit on it as far as how close the moon is to Earth. There's a certain time point.
Perigee and Apogee.
Yes, Perigee and Apogee. I hadn't seen, to my knowledge, I haven't seen any other studies that also had taken a look at that. I've only heard like a very few amount of hunters actually discuss Perigee and Apogee when it comes to like a hunting strategy. So you guys pretty much covered everything, in my opinion.
Sure. So we could spend a lot of time just on the survey, but that's not why people are listening to this podcast. So I'm just going to touch on the last couple really important parts of the survey, and is really why we conducted the survey in the first place. We wanted to understand, before we ever started analyzing these data, we wanted to understand what hunters thought would be a significant effect of the moon on deer movement. So we gave them some options. Do you think the moon, these are some of the questions we asked. Do you think the moon influences the rate of travel of bucks? So do you think they are traveling more or less yards per hour on certain moon conditions? We asked if they believed it influenced the amount of time that a buck spent bedded. We asked if they thought the moon influenced the time that a buck left his last afternoon bed. So those are kind of our three main response variables that we're going to look at throughout the rest of this podcast. Number one is movement rate, so yards per hour. Number two is time spent bedded, which those two should be inverse of one another. And what I mean by that is if a buck is moving more yards per hour, he should be bedded a lower percentage of the time. They should kind of, be inverse of one another. And then the last one is the time that a buck leaves his afternoon bed. And when we asked about those three specific metrics, what we really wanted to know is, we kind of wanted to put in context what hunters thought would be a significant effect. So we asked hunters in regards to movement rates, yards per hour. We said, okay, do you think the moon influences a buck and he will move between 0 and 25 more yards per hour, or between 25 and 50 more yards per hour, or 50 and 100, or 100 to 200? We kind of categorize it that way just to get a feel for, how much hunters thought the moon influenced buck movement. And the result of that is that, over 50% of hunters believe that the moon is going to cause bucks to move at least 50 more yards per hour than if the whatever condition of the moon wasn't there. So that's kind of our starting point for all of these analysis. We wanted to compare what the data actually said with what hunters believe to be true. And they thought that a 50 yard per hour change was significant and meaningful. So that's what everything's relative to. And then with the duration or the amount of time that bucks spent bedded, they thought that kind of that 30-minute to 1 hour range would be significant. So, for example, if we've got a certain moon condition, moon overhead, hunters thought that if bucks spent 30 minutes less time bedded than they would on other conditions, on other days where the moon wasn't that overhead position, that would be meaningful. So yards per hour, we're looking for at least a 50 yard per hour increase in movement rate to be meaningful to hunters. For time spent bedded, we're looking for at least a 30-minute change or deviation from normal for it to be meaningful for hunters. And then in terms of when a buck is leaving his last afternoon bed, most hunters thought that a meaningful change would be at least 30 minutes to an hour. So if a buck is leaving his bed 30 minutes earlier or 30 minutes later than what is normal for him, they thought that would be a meaningful change. So I go into all of that detail just to point out that all of our comparisons and numbers we're going to talk about later on in this podcast in terms of how much the moon actually influenced movement rate or the amount of time a buck spent bedded, we're going to compare it to what hunters thought would be meaningful.
Yes, which is important, right? It's not from kind of a outside perspective looking in. A general hunter might think, I've heard this from other hunters, be like, oh, they don't, it's some researcher doing this analysis. They're not going to ask the same questions that I would ask, or their opinion's going to differ. You guys took that out of the equation, right? And then you put it in the hunter's hands. Like, what do you want to know? What is important to you? What makes a difference to you, the hunter? So that is how this data is being presented.
Yep.
So, so this goes right into the results here, and then we'll kind of go into how we got there. So, from the analysis, this is what you guys found.
Yeah, and I kind of like to back up a little bit. You can keep it on this screen, but I
Okay.
want to describe a little bit of how we got here, just so we don't put the cart before the horse too much.
Yeah.
One of the greatest strengths of the study that we conducted here, and I think one of the things that really differentiates this study from other ones that we have done in the past that weren't quite as comprehensive and ones that other people have looked at, is the way that we dove into this data. And so we really wanted to make sure that we were controlling for the influence of the rut, so different rut phases, because we know that at the peak of the rut or close to peak breeding, buck movement rates are much greater than they are at other times of year outside of the rut. We know that at dawn and dusk, movement rates tend to be much greater than they are either in the middle of the day or the middle of the night. And we also know that there's a great deal of variation among individual bucks and how much they move. So one buck, even if, let's take two 4.5-year-old bucks, and I could pull up dozens of examples of this with our movement data. But if we take two 4.5-year-old bucks that are the same age, even living on the same property, they are going to move in very different ways. They're going to use the landscape in very different ways. They might be moving at different times of day. The influence of hunting pressure might be, they might respond to hunting pressure differently. So we needed to make sure that when we analyzed this moon data, we were taking all of those potential, you know, confounding variables into account. So the way that Natasha analyzed this data was she took the movement rates for a buck. So let's take a buck, let's say buck 100. Okay, we had almost 50 bucks included in the study, and many of them we had 2 years of data for, and we were getting a location on each of these bucks every 15 minutes from September through February. And then we were lining up all of these different variables: movement rate, bedding percentage, time leaving, afternoon bed. We were lining those up with the moon conditions. And we'll get into more of the moon conditions in a minute. I'm just kind of laying the background for the study design here. So for example, let's take buck number 100. And let's say we were interested in how a moon overhead at 2 p.m. in the afternoon influenced that buck's movement. To figure that out, we looked at buck 100's movements between 2 and 3 p.m. 1 week prior and 1 week after the day in question. So if we're looking at our Solunar table and it says, hey, on December 5th between 2 and 3 p.m., it's a really good time to be in the woods and bucks should really be on their feet. Well, we look at the bucks movement rates between 2 and 3 p.m. on that day and compare them with the week prior and the week after. So we're getting a really good kind of moving average of this buck's movement rates, not only to control for that individual buck, but also to control for the influence of the rut phase and the influence of time of day and all of these other variables. So every buck is essentially being compared to himself, because we know that different bucks have different personalities and there's going to be different influences all across the board for all of these bucks. We wanted to make sure we were controlling for all of that. So we compared every buck to himself within a 2-week window.
Yeah, which is a really good distinction to make. We had talked to Bronson about this on one of the episodes, just how much work Natasha had put into this when looking at the data analysis, and I can't even begin to imagine. It had to be millions of data points, and he was talking about whatever program she would run it in, she would double check it with her own that she made, which is just insane.
Yeah, she is a hardcore mathematical ecologist, and she is extremely good at what she does. If I would have done this, it would have been like formulas in Excel, and it would not have been a pretty way to go about it.
Yeah, but it is a very important thing to note. Like you said, I'm glad you brought it up, because essentially you established a baseline movement for each individual buck, and obviously just natural movement will increase and decrease during different times of the year, right? So you have to account for all of that in order to see changes in their behaviors as far as like their movement rates or bedding behaviors go. So you need to establish a baseline before you can even tell if there are differences in it. So
yeah,
and I think, sorry, go ahead.
Well, along those lines, When we start spitting out numbers here for the results that we got to, we'll say, we might say, just for example, I'm just making up numbers here. When we had this conditions of the moon, when moon was overhead and it lined up with a day rating of 4. So that would mean that the moon was either 99% new or 99% full, and the moon was overhead. It caused a difference of 10 yards per hour. That was the influence of that condition on buck movement. And so that 10 yards per hour number that I'm throwing out there is going to be the deviation from normal averaged across all of the bucks we looked at. So we looked at their average movement rate between 2 and 3 p.m., minus a week and plus a week of the day we're looking at. And then on that given condition, it influenced their movement rate and increased it by 10 yards per hour. So that's kind of how we're going to present the data, as deviations from whatever their norm was.
Yeah, and I think this page here, this is like page 3 on the publication, kind of goes over some of that, like how you're describing buck activity, how active are bucks in general, and then kind of what you just talked about as far as look at the changes here.
Yep.
So I'm going to go back up to these results here, and then we're going to kind of break the results down. So an overview of what was found. So moon phase has no effect on buck activity. Moon position has no effect on buck activity. Combinations of moon phases and moon positions have no effect. Moon phase and position have no effect on usual activity at dawn and dusk. The moon has little effect on buck bedding times, and the rut affects buck activity much more than the moon. So
yeah, so I guess if you're tuning into this, trying to figure out if the moon actually has any effect, you can just, if that's the only thing you care about, you can sign off right now, because that pretty well summarizes it.
Yeah. But we're going to go into each of these and say, like, okay, why are these the results here?
So yeah, I guess we should dive a little bit into the different ways that, like, what we compared this to. So there are, generally speaking, there are two prevailing theories out there on how the moon influences buck movement. The first one is the typical Solunar charts that you hear about. I mean, there's a dozen of them out there, and they're all very similar.
Yep.
And I guess I want to say, as a preface before all of this, we did not set out to debunk any one specific formula for how the moon influences deer movement. We're not trying to discredit anybody. People, sell these things, and our objective isn't to, say, oh, you're wrong and there's nothing to this. It's to simply evaluate whether or not the established criteria out there that people use for predicting deer movement, whether or not that's accurate.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of how we went about this. So the two most common theories out there are the Solunar theory and the red moon theory. So we'll kind of go through those one at a time, and you can tell me how you want to go about this, but I'll just start with the Solunar theory.
Yep.
So the Solunar theory takes two things into account. It takes the position of the moon into account. So that's going to be moon overhead or moon underfoot. And when I say moon overhead, most people are going to be familiar with this, but for those of you who aren't, if the moon is overhead, that means the moon is essentially above the horizon, so it's visible on the horizon, assuming there's not cloud cover and stuff. But the moon is above the horizon, and it is equidistant between its rising point and its setting point. So an overhead or underfoot is the exact opposite. It's below the horizon, you can't see it, and it's equidistant between where it just set and where it is going to rise, roughly 12 and a half hours in the future. So these overhead and underfoot periods correspond with major feeding windows. So Solunar charts generally predict major feeding windows, and then they predict minor feeding windows. And there are all sorts of schools of thought on which of those is a better window to hunt in. Some people think the major windows are best. Some people think the minor windows are best. Some people think they're equal. Some people completely disregard one and pay attention to the other. But a major feeding window is when the moon is overhead plus or minus 1 hour. So it's a 2-hour window. Moon overhead or underfoot plus or minus 1 hour. And then the minor windows are all about when the moon is rising and when the moon is setting. So as the moon is transitioning from below the horizon to above the horizon, we've got a minor window, and that's plus or minus 30 minutes of the moon rise or moon set. So that means the minor window is 1 hour long and the major windows are 2 hours long. So those moon position, major, minor, overhead, underfoot, rising, setting, that is one half of the equation for the solunar charts. The other half of the equation for solunar charts is the phase of the moon. And I don't know who originally came up with these phases of the moon. They kind of seem a little bit strange to me just based on the percentages they came up with, but we just analyzing the data based on how, it's people typically do it. So a day rating of 4, there's 4 day ratings, day rating of 1, 2, 3, and 4. In theory, based on these solunar charts, day ratings of 4 are supposed to be better days to hunt when all else is equal than a day rating of 1, meaning the deer are supposed to be on their feet more, they're supposed to be more active on a day rating of 4. A day rating of 4 is when the moon is either 99% full or 99% new. So a full moon obviously is when 99% or more of the moon is illuminated, and if the moon is 99% or more new, it means that the vast majority of the moon is not illuminated by the sun and it's essentially black. You just got a little itty bitty sliver of the moon. And then all the way down to a day rating of 1. I'm not going to go through 3 and 2, but just think it as a kind of a gradient. Mm-hmm. Day rating of 1 is when less than 90% of the moon is full or less than 90% of the moon is new. So putting all of this together to kind of simplify that, because if people aren't super familiar with solunar charts, that is a lot of moving parts there, yes, figuratively and literally. But the best time to hunt based on solunar chart predictions would be when you have a day rating of 4. So the moon is basically a new moon or a full moon, and you are within a minor window or a major window. So we broke down all of our data and looked at buck movement rates and their time spent bedded and all of these different things in a day rating of 1, day rating of 2, day rating of 3, day rating of 4, and looked at the minor windows and major windows and compared those windows to the plus or minus 1 week on the other side. And that's kind of how we got our results. So that's the solunar chart. And I guess we can kind of start diving into those results before we get into the red moon stuff.
Yeah. And real quick, in episode 208, we did an episode with Dakota Cantrell and Zach Kaiser. It is titled "Killing Mature Bucks Using the Moon." Those are 2 hunters that we are good friends with. They are very consistent in killing mature bucks. They use some of the things that we just discussed, like the solunar tables, and that Dakota is real big on major minor times. So if you want to hear, and through that, we go through some of those examples of the solunar charts that people can actually use if they want to look it up. So if people want to listen to that, they can. It's episode 208. But that's one we did with hunters that have used the moon, like solunar charts and that anecdotally. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Sure. All right, moon phase results. So the way that Natasha analyzed these data was, so remember when we were talking about our survey results, the majority of hunters believe that it was some combination of moon phase and moon position that influenced deer movement. Mm-hmm. And it was a little bit lesser percentage that thought it was just moon phase or just moon position. So we analyzed every possible combination of these. And the first one we're going to go through is just looking at moon phase. And so, like I mentioned a minute ago, the day ratings of day 1 through day 4 are related to moon phase, where a day rating of 4 is essentially completely new or full, and a day rating of 1 is much less new or full. And the way that we've got these results broken down, if you're looking at the screen, you'll see that on a day rating of 1, there was a 0.3% decrease in the amount of time that a buck spent bedded on a day rating of 1 compared to the rest of the window, that 2-week window I talked about, and a 0.3 yard per hour increase. Okay, so if you're just looking at the day rating of 1 and you haven't looked at 2, 3, or 4 yet, you might be like, oh, that makes sense because a day rating of 1 is supposed to be the worst day to hunt, so we wouldn't expect much of a change at all. So I'd expect to see, essentially no change in time spent bedded and a very little change in yards per hour. But then you go up to day rating of 4, which should be the best time to hunt based on moon phase, and we see a 0.6% increase in time spent bedded and a 4 yard per hour decrease in movement rate. That is the opposite of what we think we should see. I mean, you would think if a day rating of 4 and you're a moon phase believer, that on a day rating of 4, we should be seeing, and keep in mind, this is all relative to the numbers that we got from hunters. They said 50 or more yards per hour increase on a day rating of 4 is what we should be seeing. Well, we see a 4 yard per hour decrease. So, I'm putting all of this in the context of me sitting in my deer stand with my bow in my hand, and what are deer doing and what do I think is meaningful? A 4 yards per hour. I mean, even if it was a positive 4 yards per hour and deer were moving 4 yards per hour or more on a day rating of 4, I mean, that's 4 steps over the course of an hour. I mean, that is just, virtually, and from my perspective, meaningless.
Yeah.
And not to mention, it's in the wrong direction. It's a 4 yards per hour decrease. So it's not even going the right way. It's the opposite of what we would think to be true.
Yeah, this is, and I can't remember. I think Natasha had talked about some of the stuff when we get into the numbers, as far as there's a certain percentage that's within, what's the word I'm looking for, where there's what is eluding me, there's a name for it, basically where you have error associated. There's a set amount of error,
standard deviation.
Yes. Yeah. And this as well. I mean, even because you have to get past a certain point to be within or outside that natural error that can occur. And this isn't even close.
Yeah, and to your point, our GPS collars that we're using have about 10 yard accuracy. So if we get a GPS point and it says this buck is right here on a map, draw about a 10 yard radius circle around that point, and we're very confident that he is somewhere within that 10 yard circle. So it's not perfect, but when I guess it's probably helpful at this point to kind of put a few boundaries on what typical buck movement rates are at different times of year. When we're outside of the rut, and this is just very general, this is going to vary some, but outside of the rut in general, bucks are moving about 200 yards per hour. At peak rut, they're moving closer to 400 yards per hour.
Yep.
So think about it, just take the average of that. 300 yards per hour is about what you're going to see throughout the whole hunting season. Bucks moving 300 yards in a given hour during daylight shooting hours. And then you throw a day rating of 4 on top of that, and we have a 4 yard per hour change. So it goes from 300 yards per hour to 296 yards per hour. I'll leave it up to the listeners. I don't want to sound too skeptical here. I'll leave it up to the listeners to decide if they think that's a significant change. They're going from 300 to 296.
Yeah. Pretty negligible according to the data here. So let's we'll move on to moon position here and look at some of these results. So you kind of already discussed the major and minor windows and all that. I haven't looked forward. Are we going to get into the quote unquote red moon?
Yeah, that's later on.
Okay. All right. So I won't skip ahead too much, but the position here are the results here.
So, so the previous results I just discussed were just for moon phase, and now we're looking at just the influence of moon position. And then the next set of results we'll talk about are combining moon phase and moon position, which recall that is what the vast majority of hunters think matters. So when we look at just moon position, we see very similar to numbers to what we saw last time. In a minor feeding window, so that's either when the moon is rising or the moon is setting, we see a 0.3% increase in the time a buck is spent bedded and a 0.1 yard per hour decrease in their movement rates. So again, we are right around zero. And
Yeah.
I talked about this when we were doing our podcast version of this on the Deer University podcast. And I don't want to get too into the nitty gritty of data analysis here, but I think it's worth mentioning for people. If my hypothesis as a researcher was that the moon has no influence on buck movement rates or the percentage of time that bucks spend bedded, and I've only got collars on 40 or 50 deer, which was our sample size, I would not expect the results of my analysis to be 0.0% change or 0.0 yards per hour change. I would expect there to be a slight deviation above or below zero, depending on which variable I'm looking at, because our deer are never going, unless if we have every deer in North America collared and we've got a GPS location every minute, we're going to get really close to zero, and we should kind of, hone in our results right around zero. But to have these slight deviations above and below zero is exactly what we would expect if there was nothing going on. Alternatively to that, if there was something going on, we would expect to see significant and probably more importantly consistent effects, where if you go from day rating of 1, let's say you have a 2 yard per hour increase, to a day rating of 2, you've got a 6 yard per hour increase, day rating of 3, 10 yard per hour of increase, day rating of 4, 40 or 50 yard per hour increase. That would be a very consistent effect, where as days get better, you see more and more influence on deer movement rates in accordance with what the Solunar table predicts. That is not what we see at all. We see all of this weird flip-flopping. It's all right around zero. We see actually the greatest effect, which is still minimal, on a minor window, and then even less of an effect on a major window. So it's just, we're not getting consistent results here.
Yeah.
So
Bronson, I believe, describes that as a clear signal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's no clear signal.
So we are not seeing a clear signal, exactly.
Yeah, I like how you have the major and minor broken down here, and then also with the day ratings, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yep. So now we're looking at the results on moon phase and moon position together. So we're directly here in these results comparing what the Solunar table predicts with what the data actually tells us is happening. So on a day rating of 4, which should be the best time to be in the woods and to be hunting in a major feeding window, so that's when the moon is overhead or underfoot, we see a 1% decrease in the amount of time that a buck spends bedded, which you would expect to see a decrease in the amount of time a buck spends bedded if you were following this table. Because if a buck is spending less time bedded, in theory, the inverse of that means that he is spending more time on his feet and he's moving more.
Mm-hmm.
But then you look at his yards per hour, and it's a decrease in yards per hour. So that doesn't really make sense. You would think that you would see less time bedded and more yards per hour being traveled on the best day, but we don't see that. We see these really inconsistent, unclear signals. So on the best day, we have a 1% decrease and a 0.3 yard. I mean, that's literally like, that's 1 foot. That is 1 foot less yards per hour travel. I mean, that is just, it's absolutely nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, like I believe that's how Bronson described it in that when you guys broke it down in the video podcast and that. Yeah, there's no clear signal. You're getting these numbers that are a decrease in bedding, but also a decrease in movement, which doesn't make any sense. And they're kind of all over and hovering right around zero, right? So, which is what you would expect, like you said, if there's no significant effect of the moon. So moving on down here. So we already talked about the Solunar theory, correct?
Correct. Yep.
This is for anyone that's listening, this is on page 8 of this publication. But I do like how this is broken down. It gives you like examples here. Day 1 rating, day 4. It just gives a nice clear picture of how people might utilize the Solunar tables in their predictions and that. So like major times, minor times, day rating of 4, moon is full or new. Yeah, it just gives a clear picture for those that are listening if you want to take a look at this.
Yeah, before we jump into the red moon theory, and this kind of applies to all the stuff we're talking about, but the moon, the influence or the potential influence of the moon on buck movement is obviously kind of a complicated topic. There's a lot of different variables going on with the phase of the moon, position of the moon. There's a lot of different potential interactions here.
Mm-hmm.
And when I generally speaking, when I am thinking about or discussing the influence of either the weather or the moon on deer movement, I think it is very, and I'm not trying to call anybody out here, but if the shoe fits, wear it. I think it's relevant to talk about confirmation bias. And if for those not familiar, confirmation bias is this psychological occurrence where as humans, our brains are hardwired to find patterns in things. That's what our brains do. We try to make sense of the world around us, and we try to make sense of the things that we are observing with our eyeballs and try to be like, oh, well, that happened this time, and these were the conditions. And then I saw it again with those conditions. There must be a pattern there. There must be an effect. Well, with the moon, especially, and the weather conditions also to some extent, if we are a believer in the moon phase, let's say I'm a believer in the solunar theory, and I think on day ratings of 4, in major windows, I tend to see more deer. If I go out a couple times on those days and I see good deer moving, I'm like, oh, wow, I saw it a week ago and then I saw it today. There must be something going on there, right? And then on the day ratings of 1, when I'm in the woods, I tend to discount the observations where I also see good deer movement because it doesn't line up with this preconceived idea of deer movement that I have in my head. That's just how our brains work. So that's confirmation bias. Add on top of that the fact that even the most hardcore, dedicated deer hunters among us, we are not spending 12 hours in the woods on every single possible combination of moon phase and moon position and recording exactly how many. I mean, some people maybe, a lot of people do record how many deer they saw per sit, but they are not spending enough time on every single combination of moon phase and position and recording that data on enough of the property over enough years and observing enough deer where you can observe reliable trends, at least not near to the extent as we can get with 1 million GPS points on 50 bucks across 2 hunting seasons.
Yep.
I mean, you just can't get that level of data with just pure observations with your eyeball. So I say all of that to say that if you are a believer in the moon, it is really easy to go out and make an observation and then look at your Solunar chart and be like, oh, well, I saw what I saw today in the woods because these were the conditions. Because there's so many potential conditions. We've got minor windows and major windows and rising and setting and the phase of the moon. So if you're a believer in the moon and you don't see what you think you should see, be like, oh, well, it wasn't the right time of day. Or it would have been better yesterday because the moon phase was better. It's just so easy because there's so many potential combinations. It's easy to pick and pull and say, oh, it would have been better under these conditions, or this is why it was worse today.
Yeah. And even if you're looking at major and minor times, right, there are some days where I think you'll get like 2 majors and a minor that fall during daylight. And if you're going like 2 hours on either time or an hour on either time of a major, so 2 hours in total, and then hour in total for the minor time. I mean, that's a good portion of the daylight where you're like, yeah, I should see some movement. And deer are naturally going to get up throughout the day. So the odds of them moving throughout the day that happen to also fall in those times are kind of fairly high in general.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily because of the moon phase. Maybe it's just because it was crepuscular times, and we know deer move more when it's dawn and dusk.
Yeah. And I think another thing to note is some people will talk about the trail camera data that they have, and with trail cameras you have to. And I know, Luke, you've talked about this before. Trail cameras are only looking at observability, not necessarily movement rates, right? And that they're not quite the same thing.
Sure. That's right.
Okay. Now here's a big one, the red moon theory.
Yeah, the red moon theory. So the red moon theory essentially, it's very similar in a lot of ways to the Solunar charts there, or the Solunar theory that we just talked about, but there are a couple differences. So the red moon theory essentially says that the best time to hunt is when the sun is rising or the sun is setting, and that coincides with the moon being overhead or underfoot. So it's to me, in my head, it's almost a combination of a couple different parts of the solunar theory. It's when you've got the sun on the horizon and you've got the moon exactly 90 degrees to that, right? So the moon is up or down and the sun is to one of the sides. In major windows, so that's when the moon is overhead or underfoot at dawn and dusk, that is going to correspond with a red moon day. And in that major window, again, we saw a negative 0.4% change. So that's a 0.4% decrease in the amount of time that a buck spends bedded, and a 3 yard per hour increase in his movement rate. So that the red moon theory predicts that when that moon is overhead at dawn or at dusk, we should see a significant increase. And by surveying our hunters, that should be at least 50 yards per hour change. And we saw a 3 yard per hour change, which is essentially zero.
Yeah, this is, I'm sure we might get comments on this. There are people that live and die by the red moon theory. And I will preface this in saying, like, whatever gives you confidence in the hunting woods, go with it. And I don't care what it is. If you have confidence in whatever you're looking at for whatever tactic, then, and you feel like that is providing consistency, then go with that. But objectively, right, this is what the data is showing.
Yeah. Yeah, and kind of one of the places I always come back to with the moon stuff is, I know there's some evidence from, or I've heard that there's some evidence, whether or not it's true, I don't really know. I've never seen the research on it, but I've heard, like, with times that you really want to have your line in the water if you're fishing. Maybe the moon is more influential for the time that fish are feeding. If you're bass fishing or crappie fishing or whatever, it might be better to have your line in the water at a certain time of day than another. And maybe there is some sort of influence on that, because just visibility of bait and the way that fish eyes work underneath water. But when I think about this with the deer, it's like, what is the potential biological mechanism that would make deer want to move more when the moon is one position or another, especially when it's in the daytime? I mean, you could see some argument for having a full moon at night, so deer are moving more at night in the full moon because they can see better. Therefore, the following day, they move less during the day because they already had a full rumen from the previous night and they just didn't need to move as much. But we don't see that at all. But especially when you get into the rising moon or the setting moon aligning with the sun. I mean, the sun's influence on light is going to overwhelm the moon's influence by some crazy order of magnitude. I don't know, 1,000-fold, a million-fold. I don't know what it is, but I mean, I do not think that deer are like, oh, it's a little bit brighter outside now because the moon is 50% full when the sun's up. I mean, it's negligible in my mind. And then when you get into the position of the moon overhead and underfoot, that has more to do, based on what I hear from hunters commonly, that has more to do with the gravitational pull of the moon. And I've heard hunters say things like, oh, when the moon is overhead, the gravitational pull is pulling bucks out of their bed and getting them on their feet. It's like, teach their own. If that's what you believe to be true, then that's fine. But I have never once walked outside and been like, oh, I feel lighter on my feet today because the moon is overhead than yesterday. Yesterday I felt heavier because the moon was underfoot.
Yeah. There's lots of theories based around the moon. It is an interesting topic. But there are definitely other factors I place over the moon, the vast majority of the time, because every situation is different. But everything's kind of all situational. But weather is one thing, and by the time this comes out, the weather data podcast we did with Bronson will already have come out. I think a couple weeks ago. Actually, it'll be released on. It would have been released on September 26th. We're kind of recording this early, but I believe it's going to be episode 267. But we're going to get some people, I already know this is going to happen. Some people are going to look at or listen to that podcast and look at that data, and they're going to be like, oh yes, the data shows that cold fronts affect deer movement. It is clear, there's a clear signal there, and it's shown in this data. And they're going to be like, oh, that study was done great. And then the same people that may also use the moon are going to take a look at this and be like, oh, well, this can't be right, this is wrong. But it's the same data set, so
Yeah.
you can't say this is wrong and the other one's right. You just can't do that because it's coming from the same data.
It's coming from the same data that was analyzed in the same way. So I would go back to the confirmation bias thing there. If you're one of those people, and I'm like, please hear me here, Josh, you and the listeners. I'm really not trying to call anyone out and try to challenge your worldview. I am just very simply presenting what the data say and how we did it.
Yeah.
And the data are very clear in my mind, given I think what is a pretty robust experimental design. We've got a lot of deer. We've got a crap load of data points over a couple different years on all of these moon phases. And the analysis was very robust. We saw very consistently no to at the most a very minuscule effect that is not even close to the movement rates or bedding percentage impact that hunters thought would be significant.
Yep.
So to that point, I mean, I agree with what you said a minute ago. If hunters have an established protocol and system that they follow in regards to the weather conditions or the moon phase, and they consistently find success, by all means, keep doing what works for you. But I think it's difficult to have that system and believe that there are data out there to back that system up. If you have personal observations and you found a way to make it work, great. But I have never once seen compelling data to back up the influence of the moon on deer movement.
Yeah, that's why I brought that up. Like whatever the hunter feels is making them efficient or confident in their strategy, by all means, go for it. In full support of it. Like I said, this is just objectively what the data is showing. What I also liked about the studies, you guys went into like full moon, new moon, perigee, and apogee. And personally, from my own standpoint, I will when I'm looking at trail cam data or making observations, I'll try and keep track of the moon. And there is the piece of private I hunt in Ohio. So from a trail cam data standpoint, I feel like the observability of deer on a full moon, and again, this is just what I've had noticed. This was back in 2021, I think it was. But anyway, I felt like on the days around the full moon, I would see later morning movement. So with that in mind, it was, I think, October 27th. I stayed in my stand. My plan was to stay until 11:30 or noon, because based on the trail cam data, I was like, oh, around a full moon, I'm seeing later morning movement. I shot a target buck that day at 11:30. And the only reason I stayed in the stand was because of that theory in my head that it was because of the moon. Now, I'm also leaving out the fact that we had a wind switch, there was a cold front, so there could have been other factors, but it's very easy to get that confirmation bias, especially in that scenario. But full disclosure, the only reason I stayed in the stand as long as I did was because of it was the full moon, and I had been seeing later movement on my trail camera. So,
sure. Yeah, I remember a few years ago, I had a handful of cameras out, and there was this weird anomaly where the previous week there was minimal to no daylight activity of mature bucks, and then there was this one day where on 3 or 4 of my cameras on this given property between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. I had multiple mature bucks moving on camera in the middle of the day, very visible. And I mean, obviously, of course, I wasn't hunting that day, but once I saw that, I was like, oh my gosh, like what was happening this day. And I went and looked, and sure enough, there was a full moon. I guess the previous night, I think there was a full moon directly overhead. And so in my brain, I was like, it must have been because there was a full moon that night, and it caused the bucks to be on their feet mid morning because they needed to go fill their rumens because blah blah. All these reasons. I made it make sense in my head, and that we certainly make observations like that, and we search for patterns. And it's not to say that there aren't sometimes individual bucks or some instances where maybe the moon does have an effect. I think it's an important distinction to make here that an individual buck is an individual buck, and some bucks might move more on some conditions than other bucks. But when we look at the population scale effect, there are not consistent effects across all bucks. So if you are hunting an individual buck and you have observation data or trail camera data to indicate that this buck tends to move more on these conditions, and you feel like you can look at the dates and times and the moon phase and the moon position and be like, yeah, he's tending to be more observable or more in front of my stand on these conditions, then by all means go capitalize on it. But when we take the average of all of the bucks on all of these moon conditions across 2 years, we just, if there is an effect, it absolutely gets washed out by the population scale.
Yeah. One of the points I wanted to make was for anyone that's familiar with like the Spartan Forge app, for example, how they do their deer predictor model, I believe, is they get a lot of this radio collar data from different universities all across the country, mind you. And then they use their AI programming to look for predictable like patterns within the populace, right? So if theoretically, if there's anything going to be accurate, it's going to be that, because it's, I mean, I can't imagine how much data they have now, because I know they talk to different universities, get these different radio collar studies from all over. So I've heard the owner of Spartan Forge discuss like the moon on podcasts before, and he said maybe there was something to like illuminescence, so like the lighting of it, but again, I think even with that there was no like clear signal.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and the point with luminosity, that's very difficult for us as researchers to quantify, because it's hard to get, like, it's easy for us to get moon phase data and put it in a spreadsheet and analyze it, because that's a mathematical formula. It's like the moon changes its phase at a very consistent rate over time, and you could pull up online what's the moon phase going to be on December 16th of 2272, the year 2272, and it would tell you what it's going to be because it's a consistent formula. But luminosity is a function of A, moon phase, but B, cloud cover. And it is so difficult to get good, accurate cloud cover data on the property where a GPS study is being conducted, because like cloud cover is super variable across a county, let alone a state or a region. I mean, it's just getting that data accurately into a spreadsheet where you can analyze it is not an easy task, and unless you have an on the ground weather station on your property, it's probably close to impossible at any kind of temporal scale. So I say that to say that it's difficult for us to quantify luminosity, and we were not able to do that directly in this study. However, I believe that if there was an effect of luminosity, I still think we would have seen a signal come out in our data with moon phase, because we had so many deer over so many days over multiple years. So it's possible that an effect of luminosity got washed out in our data just because we weren't able to account for cloud cover. But I still think that we would have seen an effect. And you just pulled up the new moon versus full moon side of things.
Yep.
If that doesn't get at luminosity, nothing does. I mean, a full moon is very luminous. A new moon is very not luminous. There's no light coming from a new moon relative to a full moon. So, if there wasn't effective luminosity, even not accounting for cloud cover, you think you would see it come out in the new versus full data. And looking at what we have pulled up here, a new moon on a day rating of 4, which it's less than 1% illuminated, we saw a -1 yard per hour change from normal. On a day rating of 4, when it's 99% full, so as luminous as it's going to get, we saw a -6 yard per hour change. So it's the opposite direction of what we would expect to see. I can't make sense of these data in my head based on predictions from Solunar charts or any combination of moon phase and position that you could come up with.
Yep, I definitely agree. You guys do a good job of just depicting everything in this publication. Just nice, easy to read, easy to follow all through this as I'm scrolling through. Where was it? You guys even looked at Perigee and Apogee, which gets to like the distance of the moon to the Earth, I believe.
Sure.
Again, there was no effect here, essentially.
Yeah, and the Perigee and Apogee could even get into a gravitational pull, because in theory, the closer the moon is to the Earth, the greater the effect of gravitational pull we should feel. And it should also get at luminosity a little bit. I pulled up a chart before we started just so I kind of had a rough number in my head. But when the moon is as close to the Earth as it's going to be in its orbit around the Earth, it is on a full moon. It is roughly 30% more luminous than when it's farthest away in its orbit on a full moon. So that's not an insignificant difference in illumination. 30%. I mean, that's that's a pretty good chunk. But when you look at that, Perigee and Apogee on a day rating of 4 for both, so the darkest and the fullest, again, we're not really seeing any consistent, significant effect relative to what Hunter said would be significant, which is 50 yards per hour. On an apogee moon, which is when the moon is farthest away from the Earth on its orbit, we saw a +2 yard per hour change relative to normal, which again, extremely close to zero. On the perigee, which is when the moon is as close to Earth as it's going to be, we saw a -9 yard per hour change. Now, the -9, that's one of the largest effects that we've seen so far, 9 yards per hour.
Yeah.
But I mean, 9 steps over the course of an hour, that's still, I mean, hardly anything at all. And it's certainly not even close to what Hunter said would be significant, which was that 50 to 100 yard per hour mark.
Yeah. Again, pretty negligible in my opinion. I was trying to get if there's anything else. Man, you guys break it down very well in the study.
The last thing
data. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, the last thing I would like to point out here, just to kind of put all of this in perspective relative to the things we do know makes a difference, is rut phase and time of day. So we know that the greatest influence seasonally on buck movement is going to be the influence of the rut, where when we're in the peak of the rut, we have a much greater distance that bucks are traveling than they are at times outside of the rut. And I was trying to see if there was, maybe the graph I'm looking for is down at the very bottom here. Yeah, the moon does not affect buck activity, but the rut does. So bottom line, the most consistent and significant effect making a buck move more or less than other times of year is going to be the rut, and it vastly overwhelms any effect of the moon that might exist. And our data indicates that there is negligible, if any, effect of the moon. But even if there was, the influence of the rut is way more influential on a buck's movement rates. And then so that's at the seasonal scale. At the daily scale, crepuscular times of day are still much more influential than the moon is. So, when I'm sitting there looking at my calendar trying to figure out what days I'm going to hunt, and again, if you have a different philosophy here and you want to use the moon and to influence what times you're going to hunt, more power to you. But based on the data that we've collected and analyzed and put together in what I feel is a very comprehensive manner, if I'm going to decide when I'm going to hunt, I'm going to base it on is it dawn and is it dusk and is it the rut? And, based on the conversation that y'all had with Dr. Strickland on some of our weather data, I was, to be quite honest, a little surprised at those results. If you go back and look at the science out there on the influence of the weather on buck movement, there's not a whole lot of evidence that the weather has a strong influence on buck movement. But we found, because I believe the analysis was very comprehensive and very robust, we found that there was an influence of certain weather parameters on deer movement, right? Specifically those cold weather conditions right in and around the rut. So I guess the hierarchy that I'm going to use to determine the likelihood of me having a mature buck in front of my stand is going to be the time of year, meaning that around the rut, they're moving the most. And then it's going to be time of day within an individual day. Dawn and dusk are the best times to, catch bucks moving the greatest distance. And then third, and it's a pretty far third relative to, the scale of, or the distance moving, is weather. I'm really not even having moon in my equation at all. Number one is rut. Number two, time of day. Number three is weather conditions.
I think that's a really good way to look at it. If hunters are wanting kind of a quick, easy take home from all of this movement data as far as what it's showing. Yeah. So I know you have another meeting here within 6 minutes or so.
Oh, I've got to go in the next 5 or 10. My meeting's not till 3 though. So
yeah. So I want to be cognizant of your time and that, and I greatly appreciate you hopping on here. I know you're pretty busy. Other than what you just said, are there any other takeaways you would tell hunters from this data, or giving their hunting strategy? How can they utilize this?
I would just say don't overcomplicate things. I think for hunters that are really passionate about what they do, which is the vast majority of us that are going to be sitting here listening to a podcast on this kind of thing, we really love what we do, and we love the time that we get to spend in the woods, and we love watching deer, and we love having the opportunity to harvest deer. Sometimes I think, based on my personal experience in the past, based on talking with other hunters, I think we can almost get paralysis by analysis, and we're like, oh, but the weather's not, or but the moon's not, but the wind's not, but the, all of these other factors are not just right. It's like, sometimes I 100% believe that takes away from the joy of being in the woods and the fulfillment we get of just being in the woods. So I personally have enjoyed being in the woods much. I used to be a moon believer. I'll be the first to admit it. I've been a convert over the last few years of not believing in the moon just because of all the data that I've seen. But I used to pay attention to it, and I used to pay attention to the weather a lot more than I do now. And I used to pay attention to scent control a lot more than I do now. Now I just kind of am bare bones. I like to look at deer sign. I like to get as close to deer as I can get. And yes, I pay attention to the wind and the wind direction. And yes, I pay attention to weather conditions. But I'm not sitting there like, oh, I'm not even going to go today anymore because the conditions aren't right. Like especially for those of us that have a family and have a busy schedule, if I've got the chance to be in the woods, I'm going to be in the woods. And I'm not going to let certainly the position of the moon not being overhead or underfoot keep me from being in the woods. Like, just go enjoy your time in the woods, enjoy the opportunity you get to learn more about deer and oak trees dropping acorns and all the critters we have the privilege of seeing out there. It's just such an awesome experience, and that's why so many of us got into it in the first place, just because we love the peace and seclusion of being in the woods and not being around all the other stuff and noise of day-to-day life. I see no reason to add more noise to the situation and complicate it more than it needs to be.
Yep. I couldn't have said it any better myself. Sometimes it is best just to keep it simple and go out and learn. There's no substitute for time in the woods and getting out there and learning. But with that, I can't thank you enough, Luke, for hopping on here and breaking down the moon data. I always enjoy our conversations. I think you do a really good job of breaking all the data down and kind of simplifying things for the listeners and being able to relate to the listeners, because you yourself hunt public lands like a lot of us do. So again, thank you very much.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
But with that, this has been the Mobile Hunter Podcast, and this is the Whitetail Apprentice Series. Our guest today was Mr. Luke Resop. Everyone, have a good one.